Hi again. We're going to continue with the introductory chapters 1 and 2. In the last video, the first one on the introductory stuff, we looked at GDP, how it's calculated, why we should care about it, what is GDP growth, the different ways to calculate GDP, all those sorts of questions. Now we're going to turn to the unemployment rate, which is another important measure of the economy's performance. So the unemployment rate. And we're going to start with a simple definition that relates the labor force, L, to the number employed plus the number of unemployed. So L is what we call the labor force. N is the number of people that are employed. And U is the number of people that are unemployed. It's not the unemployment rate. It's not a percentage or anything like that. It's just purely the number that are unemployed. If you want the unemployment rate, what you have to do is take U and divide it by L. So it's the number of unemployed divided by the labor force, and that's going to give us the rate of unemployment. Now, one thing I want you to realize is that the labor force and the population are not the same thing. If we did a little circle here and say, well, the population is this entire circle. The labor force is some subset of the population. So the population is the whole thing. The labor force is a smaller part of it. So who's out of the labor force? Well, those are the people that aren't working, the people out here, the people that aren't working and aren't trying to find employment. And so you're only unemployed if you're not working and you're actively trying to find a job. If you're not working and you don't care if you have a job or not, you don't want a job, you're not looking, you're just staying home for some other reason, then you're not part of the labor force. Okay, so how do they determine the labor force? Well, they have to determine the employed and the unemployed. So how do they do that? So the unemployment rate is calculated as follows. They survey 50,000 people each month. It's done by it's the current population survey, the CPS it's called. And to be employed, you have to be working. It's a little more complicated than that. It's if you did any work for pay or profit during the survey week. So there's a week at which they call people on the phone or find other ways to get in touch with them. That's the survey week. And if you're working for pay or profit, then you're counted as being employed. If you're not getting a wage, if you're working for free, then you're not considered employed or unemployed. Now there's an exception to that. If you're working 15 hours of unpaid work in a family-owned business like a grocery store or a farm or something like that, so it's 15 hours or more, you're not getting paid, but it's a business operated by someone in your household, then you're counted as employed. It's also if you were temporarily absent from your job because of an illness, vacation, there's a strike, bad weather, those sorts of things, then you're still considered employed. So they ask all these questions during the survey. Are you working? Yeah. Are you getting paid? No. Are you working for a family? Yes. Those kinds of questions. So that's to be employed. So to be employed, basically you need to be working. To be unemployed, you don't have a job during the reference week, but you made at least one specific active effort to find a job in the last 4 weeks. So you have to be actively searching, unless you're temporarily ill or something like that. But if you're not working, but you're not looking for a job, but you've been laid off. So you were laid off 5 weeks ago. You haven't looked for a job at all. You know you're going back in 2 weeks. You're still counted as unemployed. You're not working, but you're going to go back. You want to work. You're in the labor force. There's just no reason for you to search because you know you're going to get to go back to your old job. You're just temporarily laid off. So those people would be counted as unemployed. So you're employed if you're working. You're unemployed if you're not working but searching for work. All right. Why care about unemployment? Why should we care at all about unemployment? And the book gives two reasons. The first one is that it's a measure of the number of families that are struggling. Because they're unemployed, their income's way down. You know, maybe they're getting unemployment compensation, but even so, they're going to take a big hit to their income. They're having trouble making ends meet, paying their bills, all those sorts of things. So it gives us an indication of how many people are having those kinds of difficulties. And the difficulties aren't just economic. It's both psychological costs and the loss of income. You know, it's psychologically difficult to be unemployed. It's also financially difficult. And so both of those things are important. And it's a measure of how many people are suffering from those kinds of things. It's also a measure of how efficiently we are using our resources. There's a similar measure for capital goods, you know, plants and equipment, trucks, factories, all those sorts of things. And it's called the capacity utilization rate. If the capacity utilization rate is 85%, that means 15% of that stuff is sitting there idle doing nothing. It's wasting away. It could be used to make goods and services. It's not. So that's a measure of how well we're using our resources. The unemployment rate tells us the same thing. It's a measure of how many people that could be working aren't. And so it's a measure of inefficiency. Let me pull up the a graph real quick and show you what the unemployment rate looks like over time. So I better get this off the board first. Take a second for it to come up here. So this is just a picture of the unemployment rate. We're going to have to get through the silly filter thing. Each time I turn this on, I should probably just have the filter check. This is not my overhead. This will go off in a second. It'll go off in a second. Yay. Let me turn the lights off first, and maybe we can see this a little better. Oops, this is not what I wanted. Sorry. There we go. This is what I wanted. So this is the unemployment rate. And the gray bars, if you can see them, I hope you can, are the recessions. So this is the period when output is declining. And so you can see whenever there's a recession, unemployment really spikes. And there's a lot of variation in unemployment over time. It was almost 11% in the 81-82 recession. It was 10% when it peaked in the Great Recession. Typical recession, it's 8 or 9. It could get as low down here as below 3%. Here it's below 4%. It was a little bit below 4% as recently as around 2000. So it can have a huge amount of variation over time. And most of that variation is recessions. I mean, the changing in unemployment is part of the definition of a recession. But one thing to note here, a lot of times, so the gray bars are when output is going down. Okay? When the gray bar ends, output's coming back up again. It's recovering. Most of the time, as soon as output starts going back up, unemployment starts going down, just what you'd expect. Output's going up, unemployment rate's falling. When output's going down, the unemployment rate's going up. But of the last three recessions, the Great Recession, the 2001, 91, 92, there was a little bit of a break. You can see that the peak for the unemployment rate is quite a bit after the output started recovering. So output troughed and began coming back up, and it took a little while for unemployment to peak and begin coming down. So there was a disconnect. Same thing happened in the next recession. Now, there was a little bit of that going on in the Great Recession, but it wasn't quite as pronounced. And this has come down even more. This graph's a year or two out of date right now. So anyway, that's unemployment. Changes a lot over time. Most of the change is associated with recessions. in part because it's part of the definition of a recession, but it doesn't always exactly line up with output going up or down. Okay, let's move on to something else. Turn this off. I can see it. There we go. Let's move on to the price level and the inflation rate. Now, inflation is just the percentage change in the price level over time. So once we know how the price level is calculated, we'll know how the inflation rate is calculated. Inflation rate is just the change in price from t minus 1 to p over the baseline, which is pt minus 1. So that's exactly how we measured output growth too. This is just price growth. And so inflation's easy. So that brings up the question, well, how is PT measured? You know, once we understand that, then we will understand how to calculate inflation. So there's no single measure of the price level. There's the GDP deflator. I'll define these in a second. There's the CPI, the PCE. This is the Consumer Price Index. That's the one you usually hear on the news. That's the oldest measure. This is called the Personal Consumption Expenditures Index. That's the one that's watched most heavily by the Fed. There's other measures of prices too. There's input prices. There's price indexes for businesses, for the goods they use. And all. You might want to know, okay, what's the average cost of businesses? How is that changing over time? How are their input costs changing? You could develop a price index for that too. And they've done that. But which one of these should we use? We've had all these different price indexes. Which one is best? Which one should we use? Well, there is no best measure. The measure you should use depends critically on the question that you're asking. If you're asking a question about the typical household's cost of living, that's going to be the CPI, as we'll see in a second. If you're asking about how business cost changes, you want to use some other index. So the index that you look at depends upon the question that you're asking. So now one measure is the, let me just do it this way, is the GDP deflator. And it's defined very simply. It's nominal GDP over real GDP. Remember, this was PTYT, was nominal GDP, prices times quantities. Real GDP is just YT, so that difference is PT. So when you measure it this way, you just go into the national income and product accounts, which you can get out of something called FRED, Federal Reserve Economic Data. It comes from the St. Louis Fed. We just type FRED into Google, you'll find it really fast. It's an amazing data set of macro data. You can get these things easily. Just take the ratio, drop them into a spreadsheet, take the ratio. That gives you the GDP deflator. Now what this is it's the average price of a unit of GDP. And remember that GDP is C plus I plus G plus net exports. This is the amount that households spend. This is what businesses buy. This is what the governor, can't say that word for some reason. This is what the government buys. And this is exports minus imports. So it's a measure of what we're importing and exporting. Now, we may not care at all. So if you want to know what's the average price of these goods, the GDP deflator is going to tell you. And as we'll see shortly, it moves pretty close with the CPI. But we might only be interested, though, in what households consume. So what does the typical household in the U.S. consume? Well, that's really part of C here, which is consumption, investment includes spending on housing. So we might want to take something from here, just the housing part of this. We may not care about government spending at all, but net exports, we may care about imports because that's part of what we consume. That's what a typical household consumes. So what you might want to do, and what they do is take the average household in the economy. So the CPI is constructed by taking, it's existed since 1917. So it's really an old index. It's based upon a specific basket of goods and services. So they take a look at the data on what households consume, and they say, what's the average household in the economy consume? How much housing, how much car, how much gasoline, how much food, how much clothing, schooling expenses, anything you can think of is going to be in here where they actually buy this. So this is the basket of goods and services that the typical household consumes, and that changes over time. So it's adjusted approximately every 10 years, approximately. You know, in 1940, they didn't have computers or cell phones in the typical basket. They didn't have iPads and blah, blah, blah. So you need to update this basket of goods, and they do that about every 10 years. They redo this. And the way they calculate it is they visit 23,000 stores in approximately 87 cities across the US. And then they calculate the average price of the basket. So, you know, in LA it costs $150, and wherever in Eugene it costs $140, and then blah, blah, blah. And they do it all over the country, and they just average those. And that's the average price of a basket. And you might want a population weight and do other sorts of things. And then inflation is how that cost changes over time. So there's some people out with a list. Here's the goods and services in the basket. Go to the store, write down the prices. Everyone inputs them in, and they calculate the average over all those cities, the whole basket, and so on, and they get some average price for that basket, and that's the CPI. Okay. The PCE, I'm not going to spend too much time on, but it's very similar to the CPI. It's a chain-weighted index. We talked about that with GDP. That's not all that essential. But it also, the big difference is it also includes goods that households consume but don't necessarily pay for. You know, like medical expenditures where you don't really purchase it for yourself. You might have insurance or you might not. Someone else might even be paying your insurance. You go to the doctor, get a bunch of stuff done. You pay a copay of $10 or something. Maybe it's more. And then, but what they'll do is they'll impute what the cost of that medical service costs a typical household, and that's included in this basket of goods. And again, this is the one the Fed watches most closely over time. The other thing I want to note is that most of these are normalized. So the CPI and the PCE are normalized. Actually, so is the GDP deflator. For instance, the CPI is set so that in 2005, the base year, it's equal to 100. So if the basket of goods costs 200, they just multiply it by half to bring it down to normalize it to 100, and they keep doing that. So they just normalize it. This just makes it easy to keep track over time. So if in 2006, the same basket cost $106, that's 6% inflation. It just makes it a lot easier to calculate the inflation rate. So when you actually look at these data, they're normalized in that way. Okay. Now let me try this picture thing again. Let me bring up a picture that I meant to bring up that was up before, which is that picture of the CPI and the PCE. Oops. Should be up any second. There we go. And there's our friend, the reminder. Come on. Okay. So the blue line is the CPI. The red line is the GDP deflator. This is inflation. So we can see in the 70s, by the CPI, it was up to 13% approximately. CPI, GDP deflator was a little lower. You don't get very different answers when you look at the two of these, but the CPI tends to move around a little bit more. It's a little more volatile. It's a different package of goods, essentially. But the main message here is they tend to move closely together. You can see here, in the Great Recession, we actually had negative inflation, deflation they call that. Not according to the GDP deflator, it was simply falling. So this is called disinflation, when inflation's falling. When you actually have negative inflation like we had here, that's called deflation. And so depending on which index you look at, we either had deflation or we didn't, but prices were clearly falling. From as soon as the recession hit, boom, they dropped pretty fast, and they've recovered somewhat. So the inflation rate's up, but it's not up at their target yet. If you were to put the PCE on here, it would look really close to the CPI, but it's a little tiny bit lower. It's about 0.5% lower just for technical reasons. It uses a different amount of goods. So it's not a lot different. When it does differ, the Fed tends to look at the PCE rather than the CPI. Anyway, there's a quick look at what the GDP deflator looks like and the CPI looks like. Uh-oh, I better turn the light back on. Oops. Okay. Okay, why should we care about inflation? I mean, it's pretty obvious why we care about unemployment, right? As we said, it's a measure of the houses that are struggling. We can see why you might want to care about GDP. If GDP is falling, we've got less stuff to pass around. Somebody's going to get less than they had before. But why should we care about inflation? I mean, the Fed really seems to react strongly to any threat of inflation. If there's any threat of inflation, they want to raise interest rates, slow the economy, make sure it doesn't happen. What are they so afraid of? Well, the first cost of inflation, the first problem with inflation is what we call transactions or menu costs. And this is just what it implies. This is the cost of changing prices. This comes from, say, a restaurant. You're a Mexican restaurant. People spill stuff all over. They're eating their chips. Stuff goes all over the menu. So you got to put plastic covers on them. You have them professionally done. You can't just print it off your computer because they're very colorful and have pictures and things all over them. So if you had to change that every week because you have really, really high inflation in your country, that's going to be quite costly to your business. Think about a grocery store running around and changing every price. Okay, let's increase every price by 5%. You've got to run around and change every price tag in the store. That could be quite costly to do. Those are resources that could be employed doing other things. And so it's resources that are wasted, in some sense, merely on changing prices. Now, this isn't as bad as it used to be, because some restaurants now, they print a new menu every morning on their computer. It's just a paper menu and no big deal. When they change their prices, it's not that hard. But there's still costs, and the more frequently you have to change your prices, the bigger that cost is going to be, and you're going to change them more frequently when the inflation rate's higher. People on fixed incomes get hurt. Some people's retirement income, say, is fixed in dollars, so they get $2,000 a month no matter what. That's their income. It's not going to change. Others are indexed for inflation, but some aren't. If your income comes from bond payments, those are fixed. So the payments from bonds, if you own a lot of bonds, you get a fixed dollar amount each month, and that doesn't change with inflation. So if you just get $2,000 a month and the price level's doubling every month, because you've got a really high inflation country, or every year or whatever, your money is going to go around. It's not going to go as far. Your money's going to go around. I didn't mean to say that. Your money's not going to go as far, and so you're going to have less money, or less. You can buy less stuff with the same income, so you're going to get hurt by that. It creates uncertainty about the future. This is particularly true with variable inflation. About future prices, and makes long-term contracts harder to enter. So it's much more difficult, if you don't know what prices are going to be 5 years from now, to enter into a 10-year contract. And if inflation is really high and really variable, is it going to be 10%? Is it going to be 15? Is it going to be 20? Is it going to be 5? I don't know. That's going to make it really hard to make plans for the future, do investment, and that sort of thing. It tends to hurt lenders, help borrowers. If you have a variable interest rate, one that varies with inflation, that's not so true. But if you have a fixed interest rate, that's going to be true. This is when there's unexpected inflation. So your housing payment's a certain amount each month, and when you set that contract, the person loaning the money expected 5% inflation. So they say, okay, you pay me this much each month. I've got a 5% inflation premium built into that. We're fine. Then inflation turns out to be 20%. The money you're paying back, because you've got a fixed contract in terms of the number of dollars, is worth less. So you're paying less in real terms than was expected in the terms of the contract. And so essentially what's happening is money is getting redistributed from the lender, who's not getting as much, to the borrower, who's not paying as much as the contract, as the person thought you would be when they made that contract. That's not really an overall cost, but it is a redistribution. It can also distort tax payments. If they're not adjusted for inflation. Think of an income tax. Your income's rising just because there's inflation. You're not making any more in real terms. You can't buy any more stuff. But you're getting into higher and higher tax brackets because your income keeps going up. So if they don't adjust the brackets, it can distort what people expect, what people wanted when they set those tax brackets. We'll look at the optimal inflation rate and some of the problems with deflation later in the course. All right, let's move on to the last two topics for today. How are the unemployment rate, the inflation rate. Might as well just start doing it now. Pi is the symbol for the inflation rate, and we'll be using that a lot. So the unemployment rate, pi, which is the inflation rate, and output, unemployment, inflation, and output. How are they related? So we're going to look at two things, Okun's law and the Phillips curve. So let's start with Okun's law. Let me start this off by, sorry to do this, pulling up another graph. And this is a graph showing Okun's law. If we can get past the silly filter message, and we will. So what this plots on one axis is going to be the vertical axis is the change in the unemployment rate. And down here is output growth since 1960. And what you can see is there's a fairly strong negative relationship between the two. So this relates unemployment to output. The slope of that line is about 0.4. So there's several things we want to conclude from this graph. That graph's in your book, so I'll let you open your book and do it that way if you want to keep following along. Let me make some points about this. So first, it's downward sloping. And the fit is pretty good. Most of those points are close to the line. The slope equals minus 0.4. So what does that mean? That implies a 1% increase in output growth causes unemployment to go down by 0.4%. This is even better. 2.5% increase in output growth leads to a 1% decline in unemployment. So it's telling us that the relationship between output and employment is it takes a 2.5% change in growth to cause a 1% change in unemployment. Okay? And the last thing is that where the vertical line crosses zero, not the vertical line, the line. The line crosses zero. That's where there's stable employment. When output growth is approximately 3%. So that's telling us that we need a 3% rate of output growth to keep the unemployment rate from changing. Now that's changed a little bit recently. This is probably more like 2 to 2.5%. But you need a certain amount of growth for to keep unemployment constant. So where does that number come from? Where does this 3% come from? First, population growth is part of output growth. This is population growth, so output must grow to keep unemployment constant. So if the population is growing, the output's stable, the number of jobs is stable, you're going to get more and more unemployment. So you need the rate of jobs that are being created in the economy to grow at about the same rate as population is growing, if there's no productivity changes. So the second thing is if productivity, output per person, if productivity goes up, that is, you need less workers to produce the same quantity, produce the same output. You're going to need output growth to keep employment constant. To keep unemployment constant, I'm sorry, or employment constant. So just do an example. Suppose population growth, so if population growth goes up by 1% each year and productivity goes up by 2%, which isn't too far off, then you need 3%. You need output growth of 3% to keep employment constant. Because this is going to cause your need for people to go down by 2%. This is going to cause you need more jobs to help to absorb the population. So when you put those things together, you're going to need 3% output growth just to keep employment constant. So Okun's law tells us how unemployment and output are related and where the stable level of output is. Or the stable level of employment is, sorry. Okay. Did you get this? I'm not sure I said that very well. Did you get this part? When you have population growth of 1%, output has to grow by 1%, and jobs will then grow by 1% to keep employment constant. Okay? That's if there's no productivity change. When there's keep population constant, if productivity goes up by 2% per year, you need 2% less people per year. So you need output to go up by 2% to absorb those people that you don't need anymore. And so when you put that together, you need 3% output growth just to keep employment constant. Okay. Now let's do now that was useful during the Great Recession. A lot of us were trying to figure out how big the stimulus package would be. Well, if you know that full employment is, say it's 5%, and it might be lower than that, but say it's 5%, and say the current unemployment rate is 10%, then you know you need unemployment to come down by 5%. That means you need to change output growth. You can figure out from Okun's law exactly how much you need output growth to change in order to get an unemployment rate change of 5%. And so you can say, well, how will government spending affect output? Then you can use the Okun's law to say, okay, if we change output growth by this much, that's going to change unemployment by this much. And a lot of us use that as a quick way to calculate the change in unemployment during the Great Recession. It just relates it to the change in output, which is very, very convenient. Now the Phillips curve relates inflation to output. So you can use the Phillips curve to figure out how inflation and output are related. Then you can use Okun's law to change that into a relationship between inflation and unemployment. And so it's useful that way. So the Phillips curve, let me pull it up while I'm talking here. The Phillips curve just a second. Was first discovered in 1959 by A.W. Phillips. He actually looked at wage inflation versus output. We're going to look at price inflation versus output, but as we were just saying through Okun's law, it's really the same thing. So Phillips actually looked at, let me wait till this comes up and it'll be easier. So this is the change in the inflation rate. And this is unemployment. Not quite as good a fit as the as Okun's law, but this is the best fitting line to those points. It's a downward sloping line. It looks like there's a negative relationship between unemployment and output. This point here is where inflation would be zero. That's what we think of as a natural rate of unemployment. This implies it's pretty high, close to 6%. It's probably a little lower than that. The data's a little bit dated. This is only through 2010. If you update this, this is right in the Great Recession, so it kind of distorts things, pulls it to the right a little bit. If you use a different data set, the natural rate, this point here would be closer to about 4 or 5%. But anyway, this is what we call the natural rate of unemployment because that's where inflation would be zero. So what this is saying is that if you have a really low inflation rate, that means the economy is probably overheated because low inflation means output's really booming. Or low unemployment means output's really booming, so you ought to have inflation. When you have really high unemployment like we had in the Great Recession, we saw earlier that the inflation rate actually became negative. You're going to get really low inflation with high unemployment. So as unemployment goes up, that's an indication that output's growing slower, that the economy is in a recession. That's going to cause prices to fall or lower inflation. And as the economy is booming in this direction, then you're going to get inflation. And somewhere in here is the sweet spot where the unemployment rate, that's the one you want to target, where prices are going to be exactly stable. So there's the Phillips curve. So let's just make some notes here quickly. So there's two conclusions from the Phillips curve. One, the line is downward sloping. So what that tells us is as unemployment falls, inflation tends to rise. Second, inflation is zero when unemployment equals around 6% in the graph I showed you. Though often the estimate is a bit lower. 4 to 5%. Depends on how you calculate the Phillips curve. But anyway, that's what the Phillips curve tells us. Now the book's going to, a lot of what the book will be about is how to avoid the problems that we see in these two curves, or the Phillips curve in particular, which is, again, how we can have really high employment, low unemployment, and stable prices. What's the trick in bringing that about and hitting the sweet spot that we've seen here. Okay, well, that's the end of the first 2 chapters, and see you again soon.